so grateful for you to be here tonight. Well, we're excited to announce that we have a real, when we often throw out the phrase a gentleman and a scholar, but we truly have a gentleman and a scholar with us tonight to talk to us about this. I am really excited about this, and I think you are too, and that's why you're here, but I don't know how many people realize how significant it is that there is now an LDS, a version of the New Testament that has been translated from the original languages by an LDS scholar that's designed for the LDS audience. Many thought we were trapped forever, these are my words, not anybody else's, by the King James Version. And I think this is opening a door, saying that there are some things, in as much as we believe the Bible is only, it's translated mostly correctly, I guess we could say. And it kind of leaves the door open for work like this, and I think this is an incredibly important step for us as Latter-day Saints to have a translation designed for Latter-day Saints of the New Testament. And I hope that the word gets out and that people realize how significant that is. So Tom, I'm just in awe of you for having done this. Thomas Wayment is professor of classical studies at BYU. He has authored or edited or co-authored countless articles, a number of books. He completed a PhD in New Testament studies at Claremont Graduate University and continues to publish extensively on the New Testament. He served as the publications director of the BYU Religious Studies Center for about 5 years. I guess that terminated not too long ago. We have a few of, some of them have already been bought out, but some of his other books that he's worked on, we have here, and we can get any of them eventually. So if there are others of his titles that you're interested in getting, please let us know and we will. But this book, I don't know how many they printed to begin with, but they soon ran out of stock, and everybody was out for a few weeks, and they did a new printing, and now I understand they're out of stock again. So we have a good supply here. We learned the first time, and they've also announced the publisher. It's the Religious Studies Center, BYU, and Deseret Book, a joint publication. Even though we tried to convince them to do it to begin with, they are going to do a hardback version in March. So right now it's only available in paper. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Tom Wayment, and he'll take whatever time he needs, and then we'd like to save time for questions and answers, so save those up. And we'll probably bring that, well, what time is it now? Is it quarter after? I've gone too long.
Just about 10.
10 after. We'll somewhere around 7 o'clock, or if it goes past 7, we're not worried about it. But we want you to have an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to hook you up here. And let's see, let's test this.
Is that okay in the back?
You got yours.
I've got mine. I brought my own copy, unsigned.
We had one author that used to sign every one of his books that he could, and I remember more than once he would look at a book that wasn't signed. He goes, "Oh, this is rare. It's not signed."
That wasn't me. Thanks for coming, everyone, and for those of you who are this is a first, thank you, an extra thanks, and this is my second time, so we're sharing this newness together. Let me just say a few things. I'm going to give you an outline of what I'd like to share today, and mostly speak extemporaneously, but I do have some notes of things that I want to cover. So first of all, I'd like to talk about how this project got started, what exactly led me to do that. The second thing, I'd like to talk about the process that led to translating and be as transparent as I can, how I did it, what I was trying to do. And then last of all, I'd like to share some of what was hinted at, I think, by Kurt, that if we think of this as monumental in any way, I would like to share my perspective of navigating the publication of this book, which I think is an interesting topic and moment, and try to be clear there. So what started me down this road? First of all, I started down the road about 11 years ago. I had a PhD in hand at the time for about a decade, and I had always wanted to do this, but something pushed me more than anything else to do it, and it has to be anecdotal. That's the only evidence I had. But I would have students come to me, and I should have said earlier, I taught religious education for 18 years, and have just now recently moved to classics. And during my time in the religious ed classroom, I would invariably every semester have students come to me and say, Professor Wayment, Brother Wayment, I read the Bible in my mission language because I don't know why, but I just connect with it, but I don't connect with the Bible that we're using, the LDS KJV. And invariably they would say things like, I even pray in my mission language. And with a little bit of talking, about 100% of them, maybe more, simply do not understand the language of the Bible. They feel foreign talking to God with thee and thou, and they find the Bible that is in front of them impenetrable. And so I decided about a decade ago that I would translate it for my students. Just to be in the classroom and to say, here's a PowerPoint slide, and I'm quoting Matthew 24 today, and here's what it would read from the Greek. And I had a great experience with that. And I began to kind of do this as a project on my own that I had never intended to publish. And the reason I had never intended to publish, and it may come across jokingly, but I do mean it seriously, most translators of the Bible die. Young, violently, and there's this idea that you string these people up, so I didn't want to be that person. And so through a series of false starts and stops and starts again and etc., over that first 5-year period, I produced Matthew. And I started on some of Paul's epistles, but I didn't make it very far. And about 5 years ago, I decided I'm going to put this at the forefront of what I'm doing, and I need to make some major decisions in this process. And as I dove into doing this, I decided if I'm going to make it available to my students, again, never intending to publish this, I decided I need to decide where this Bible fits and why do an LDS translation of the Bible. And so in Bible theory or Bible translation theory, Bibles exist on what's called a functional equivalent and a literal equivalency spectrum. And at the far end of the literal equivalency spectrum is a Bible like the King James. And if you were able to read Greek, or if you can read Greek, you can almost line up the Greek and the English of the King James Version, and the words will almost fall in the exact same place. And that favors literalness over meaning. And that is a way that was really popular until about the 19th century. But in the early time when this was done, that's the way you did a Bible. They're very literal. They sacrifice meaning all over the place, but they want to tell you that this is a Greek word, and I've translated it, and when I don't have an exact Greek word, I put it in italics. At the far end of the spectrum is the Bible that I was raised on academically called the NRSV. It's a wonderful translation, but it's something that we call paraphrastic translation. And that means that the translator is going to prioritize meaning, but it's going to add words to tell you what things mean. It's going to explain. And that's not duplicitous. That is people with well-meaning efforts saying this is the best we know today what it means. And so if you put the KJV here, this is a strange occurrence for all Mormon scholars. The KJV is the Bible we use on Sunday, and the NRSV is the Bible we use every other day of the week. And so we have this kind of clash. Where are we as a people? On that spectrum is the RSV, and these are all excellent Bibles if you would like to use another translation. The RSV is intentionally a revision of the King James Version, completed in the mid-19th century. The ESV, which you can find on places like Bible Gateway, etc., for free, is a very literal translation that tends to be mid-spectrum. And the reason I mention the ESV is I decided early on that that's the way I see the text. I like to be faithful to the text as much as possible, but trend towards meaning, so that when something means something, and I can give you the exact word, I would favor telling you what it means, so that you can be part of that culture of understanding. I was encouraged in my decision by the church's acquisition of the Spanish Bible, the Reina Valera, which is a wonderful Bible. And one of the things that is often not said loud enough and often enough is that the church acquired a modern language translation with the Reina Valera. And so in 2008, the church had a really interesting experience where its English speakers were using the worst published Bible that the church had. And I mean that literally. The King James Version was sacrificing students all over the place, and the church bought this cutting-edge translation in Spanish. In fact, Elder Scott approached some colleagues of mine at BYU in that period when they're trying to attempt to buy the Bible, and they thought that their efforts to buy an even more modern translation of the Bible were being thwarted because they were Latter-day Saints. And they asked a committee of BYU scholars to use their credentials to see if they could buy a copyright to an even more modern translation. It's a great Bible. If you read Spanish, I would encourage you to use the Reina Valera. It's wonderful. They've done that now in Portuguese in 2013, I believe it is. They've done it more recently in French, and I understand that they have one in German. So they are fast improving the Bible culture of the church. And strangely, what can happen now is on your pew, you can be reading it in King James, and the person next to you can be reading it in a more clear, a more accessible, and a more modern translation of the Bible, which, by the way, includes different JST references and all sorts of wonderful new updates. So I thought, why not the LDS edition? Why not do one? And then again, I remembered that people die doing this. Next thing that really pushed me here, and it's part of the heart and soul of this, and I'll be very transparent. I started translating, and I got to about Matthew 8 is the chapter I believe it is, and realized that I had to do new notes. The notes of the King James Bible that you have are good. They're generated by a 1970s committee working on a Commodore 64 computer purchased at Radio Shack, which is true. That's not urban legend. I actually know the person that did it. And what they did is they put together a program where they could feed in the entire text of the King James Bible, and then someone sat down, and these were Institute students at the Cardston, Alberta, Canada, and they would type in, I wonder where every place a camel appears in the New Testament, or the Old. And you have a footnote as a memory of that. And many of the footnotes in the LDS edition are a computer generation saying, wow, I wonder how often redemption appears. That's why you have a topical guide there, which is utterly useless in the electronic age. But it was a really big thing then. The other thing that you have is the committee's notes. And the committee that produced the 1979 through 81 scripture used their notes from their Bibles that they had written in the bottom, etc. So they were good. They had good notes. But as I realized, as I'm translating, I'm coming across texts that are different. I'm coming across doctrinal ideas and things that need some explanation. I'm coming across things like the JST and how does it enter into this story and other things like that. And I start writing notes. And by about Matthew 25, and this is terribly arrogant to say, but I'll be honest with you, I was enamored with my notes. I didn't think the text was what was really the cutting edge of this. It was the notes. And I say that because I was discovering, I kind of knew these things, but I'd never said them in print or out loud. The office of deacon, the 11-year-olds now, the young boys, their office is modeled on female service in the church. And I wanted to say that somewhere. A deacon is a female servant in a home. And Jesus took that model and he said, that's what I want you to be. And there's a female deaconess in Romans, and I wanted to say that, and I wanted to help Latter-day Saints not go, oh my gosh, there's a deaconess, we need to react strongly to this. And so there's a note there to kind of explain, what does it mean when we have a deaconess? What does it mean that people like Mary Magdalene paid for Jesus's ministry in the office of a deacon? And now you'll find that footnote in Luke 8:3. And so in all of these ways, I thought there is a rich discussion that Latter-day Saints could be part of that's not hostile, that could be helpful, and that I hoped would help you. The other thing that I ran up against in that early period, and that still I want to be very sensitive to, is things like the 1992 First Presidency Statement that the King James Bible is the acknowledged and I dare say canonical Bible of the Church. I'm hesitant to use the word canonical personally because they didn't say that. That's the way the popular audience took it, but they said this is the Bible to be used by the church. But they have this great phrase, and this has opened another little door, or opened the door a little further. They said, other Bibles are easier to read. And I thought, okay, I'm going to help that if I can. And so I pushed ahead. So my early period, that kind of first part of what I wanted to say today, was defined, and I want to be very clear about this, with an interest for students. I wanted them to understand. My dissertation advisor, when I did my PhD, he said, Tom, you'll dig one foxhole and you'll die in it. And that's your scholarly career. Choose it well where you dig it. And so he viewed all of scholarship as a kind of defensive posturing. And I was starting to articulate my own efforts as I'm going to dig a foxhole, I'm going to translate the Bible, and I'm going to be defending myself for the rest of my career. But I wanted my students to understand it because they're dying. The King James Version is good. It's really good in some places, and it's worst in Romans. I say that unabashedly. The King James Version low point is Romans. Its second low point is Isaiah. There are tons of mistakes. Hopefully there are not tons of mistakes in mine, but there are tons of mistakes that they just didn't simply understand Greek like we do today, and especially Hebrew. And so we've improved a lot of things. Most of them don't matter a lot. I'll acknowledge that, but some do. And so I wanted my students to bring the Bible back into their spiritual identity. So that's what I did. Now my process, and hopefully can be clear about this and not too technical. There is no question today among academics what text you translate to create a new Bible. So it's not like you have to decide, well, I'm going to use this manuscript and this. There's something out there called NA28 or Nestle Aland 28. And the Nestle Aland 28 is a project that's been being worked on. It's 28 stands for the 28th edition. And whenever scholars discover new texts, like a new fragment of the New Testament, it's submitted to a Bible Institute in Münster, and they add it to the apparatus of the NA series. And so every time a whole new Bible is found, which happened about 3 years ago, there was one found strangely in Slovakia, and a complete Greek Bible, and that's now collated and sent to Münster, and it's added. And so any Bible you pick up today that has been done with the year 19 in front of it or 2000 in front of it will be a derivative of the NA28, or the 26 if it's years older. And so I set out to translate the NA28. And what that means is that there are passages now, like John 8, Luke 22, 43, 44, Mark 16, 9, and lots of others that simply aren't part of your Bible. So here I was translating, and the first major moment I came to, I have to make a decision. The NA28 tells me that text doesn't belong in my Bible, but my King James Version says it does. And so I, for the most part, have an exact translation of NA28, and you'll see bracketed text. You'll see a double bracket that will tell you that text is questionable. And in the footnote, I will tell you how questionable it is. If it's up in the main text, it means it's very likely original, but the manuscripts are in disagreement. If it's in the footnotes, it tells you the manuscripts seem to say it's not there. One of the big casualties to that is 1 John 5:7, clearly not part of the original text of the New Testament, and other places that you'll see. But unlike other Bible translations, I also translate those so you have them. So even if I said this doesn't belong here in the footnote, I'll translate it for you. There was a real challenge I faced early on, and this came particularly in Mark 16:9 through 12, which is a text that is added to the Bible later, which had quotations and echoes in the Book of Mormon. And so I was faced for the very first time with this issue. What do I do now when restoration text supports a text that doesn't appear to be original? And I tried to be transparent about that too. I note that in the footnote and say that the Book of Mormon echoes or uses phraseology that is similar to this passage. The big ones being the doxology of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 5, verse about 35, 34, right in that range, which is quoted in the sermon to the Nephites, but is clearly not original. And so I had to remove it from mine, but in the footnotes be transparent. I tell you those things not to give you detail, extraneous detail, but to tell you that the text that I produced is academically sound, is responsible, and you should be able to share it with any Christian brother or sister as a component of our shared faith. They will recognize that Bible. They may not like the translation. I'm not saying that they'll love that. I think they would be fine with it. But more importantly, what happened here, and this is something that was near and dear to my heart all along, is that our missionaries are no longer speaking Bible of America. So that when all of us, or maybe all of us, most of us, I think here, are all trending towards grayer hair, when we served missions, we read the Bible that the people we were teaching read that language of the Bible. A student of mine 2 years ago came to me after class one day and said, "Professor Wayment, I got to share a really fascinating story. I read to an investigator, I think it was Tennessee, he read James 1:5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who upbraideth not." And he said, I was fascinated with this response. The person talking to him said, "Is that in the Book of Mormon?" That's a loss. They don't know that anymore. They don't speak that way. So in every other, this is true, in every other country, we adopt the Bible of the local people. We take their Spanish or their Italian or whatever it might be, and we use that so we can communicate with them. We need to do that in English, because now they use a foreign, or we are actually using the foreign Bible. They've moved on to the NIV. Primarily, that's the #1 Bible being sold in the United States today. And to communicate in their language, we have to share a common Bible language. My other fear in that is that when we develop our spiritual selves, our spiritual identity, I love that it's informed by the Book of Mormon. I hate that it's not informed by the Bible. Our students can't quote it. Our students aren't aware of it. Our students are unfamiliar with its stories. And some of them think it's written in a foreign language. And it gets worse as we go along the spectrum of foreign language or second language English speakers, who it's absolutely impenetrable. So my process. Another thing that New Testament scholars do, and probably doesn't make it much into these discussions, but I'll say it tonight. Bible was performed in the first century. So when we go to church, we have a Sunday school setting where we read a verse and we talk about it, but they had someone perform the Gospel of Mark. So they would come to their setting, and the preacher or the pastor would, in dramatic voice and potentially even with characters, enact the scene using Mark. And we've lost orality in our Bible, and that's okay, our culture shifted. But one of the things that I did after I translated it out, so I sat down with the Greek and I translated it out with no English materials to kind of compare. I created my own, and then I compared it first of all to the ESV, which was my target kind of language family. And then I compared it to the NRSV. And after I had made changes and adjustments based on that, I read it aloud. I wanted it to be readable like the first century audiences had it, that it's fluid. I tried very hard to maintain author voice. For example, Mark's Greek is about the level of a 6th grader. He doesn't write Greek that well. And he says things like, I'm not worthy to bend down. And you all know I'm not worthy to bend down and tie his sandals, because you all know that story from Mark, Matthew, and Luke, who corrected Mark. Mark says, I'm not worthy to bend down. And I tried to leave those type of things where Mark isn't as precise. He's raw. He connects 63% of his verses by and or immediately. His stories is this running passion narrative. Just, we're going to get to the end as quick as we can, and everything happens immediately. And then you get to Luke, and it's elevated. It's classical Greek almost. His Greek is refined. He's well thought out. And so I tried to not smooth out that. I hope, in a sense, that when you're reading Hebrews, you have a feel. That's probably the best Greek in the New Testament. Wonderful Greek. When you read 1 Peter, really, really good Greek, and then strangely, 2 Peter has terrible Greek. And I say that in the notes and help you see we've seen something happened in the authorship of these, something different. And then I would read it out loud, and I would perform it to myself, which sounded really weird and felt really weird, and it gave me a lot of dry mouth, but I hoped it achieved something. And then I sent it out to 5 people to review it, and I had one more person read it aloud. And that produced the text I wanted. The footnotes went through 8 revisions, and each one of those revisions caught many things, and I'm afraid introduced new things, and so hopefully we've caught most of the errors. Errors kill you in Bible translation. Those of you, I think Kurt mentioned tonight an $85,000 Book of Mormon. I think the most valuable Bible to this day, if we don't get back into the papyri, like Sinaiticus or Vaticanus, is the 1614, I believe it is, Wicked Bible. And the Wicked Bible is that a young man, apprentice, printing the King James version of the Bible, removed the word not from the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And they pull, so they're pulling these Bibles, and they pull, I think they have about 18 or 30 in that range in print before somebody realizes you want to own this Bible because it encourages, whatever. And they jailed the printer, they jailed his apprentice for longer, and they destroyed the Bible. And if you ever find a wicked Bible, they're worth more than probably all of us collectively in this room. What I mean by that, if you don't know this, the 1979 printing of the Bible has one typo. It has a typo at Luke 6 verse. It's on the right-hand side of the page, 2/3 of the way down, and sinner is misspelled with 3 N's. That is the only typo in that Bible. In the text, it has numerous, in fact, it has dozens of typos in the notes, especially in the Bible dictionary where references don't go to the right thing. But one in the text, and that's a worry for me. If I make the wrong footnote error or the wrong error, you know how that goes. All right, so I'm still living. Things are good. Now, my last few moments, yes, this will be perfect. And I don't want to keep you too long. I want to talk about navigating the publication thing. I've heard some great stories about how it happened and kind of committees of overseers in dark rooms and things like that. So I'll be very clear what happened. I was managing director at the RSC at the time that this was submitted for publication, and I would have typically marshaled it through the editorial process. But knowing that this absolutely had to be done apart from me, independent entirely, I turned it over to then Associate Dean of Religious Education, Dan Judd. And I said, Dan, I cannot know who the reviewers are. I don't want to know. I don't want to be involved. And if it's a no, it's a no. And if it's a yes, it's a yes. But you have to handle it. I simultaneously did something that a very dear friend of mine, and I won't say his name in this context, but a very dear friend of mine has some deep connections in Salt Lake. And I don't want to say this as endorsement. It was genuinely to save my hide. I said, would you kindly ask friends of yours to ask, would this be okay today? I'm not asking for a letter. I'm not asking for a saying this is okay. But could you have some members that have different colored chairs than I do read this? And they came back unanimously, yes, we like it. And that was encouraging for me, so I sent it for review, and I sent it for another type of blind review. Dan Judd came to me and asked, can you give me a list of reviewers? And I gave him a list of 8 reviewers, 3 of whom not to review it, and 5 of whom would do a really great job. And he had the people not review it, that I said don't have it, review it. And I only know that because it's a very small world that we exist in. And so by their comments, I was able to track down who it was. They gave great reviews, and they both recommended it for publication with some revisions. And that's what I think will help you a little bit. I didn't know what the sensitivities would be. You know, I've joked tonight about, you know, will they string me up and things? And no, they did not. There are 2 things they asked for in this in the process. In the footnotes, there's a world-class scholar. His name is Richard Hayes. He's at University of Virginia, and he developed a series that when 2 texts are using each other, we categorize the way they use it through what's called an intertextual method. And a first level borrowing is called a quote, of course. Second is called an allusion, and the third is called an echo. And so a dear friend of mine at BYU put together the entire text of the Book of Mormon electronically and put it in a database, and he put the entire King James Version in a database. And I said, tell me every time they have 3 words in sequence together. And it generated 6,000 hits. And I sat down with those 6,000 hits and compared them and found every single place that the Book of Mormon uses the language of the King James Version, English, in the New Testament. And I put those in the notes, and I used Hayes' quote, allusion, and echo. And the first review came back and said, you can use allusion and echo, but we don't want to use quote. And one of the really fascinating things was this explanatory note. We don't know how that actually worked, so let's not confuse. And I was glad to do that. So originally, the first edition, when there's a Book of Mormon quote, which I still use quote because when it's in my field, 5 words in sequence that are the same are considered a quote. And I still think of it that way. But now I've tried to be more clear by saying, here are the words they share. Because quote was not meant to be antagonistic and say that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century product, just simply using the scholarship of our day. On that side note, I do believe that this is the first publication to contain every single allusion and echo of the Book of Mormon, that the Book of Mormon has, including the Doctrine and Covenants. Then I did that later, and then the Pearl of Great Price. So they're there as well. The other thing then, so I made those changes. It was slated for publication, and due to, anxiety or whatever it might be, it was decided by the committee that was reviewing it that they should solicit 2 more reviews. And they solicited a second review by people who sit in purple chairs. And I don't know who reviewed it at that time. And they got a second round of this will be okay. Please don't misinterpret that as imprimatur. This was always, is this the right time? Is this the right climate? Is this helpful? And never we give a magic wand and this is something that we would recommend. It's simply, will it help? And we receive back a yes. That last review, and this was the one thing that was added. And I find this fascinating because I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. Is that mine? No. Okay. And in their introduction, I had the note to the reader, and if those of you who have it, there's a quote at the bottom of the page. And the reviewer came back and said, we want this quote in there. And I'm going to read it in full because I feel really hesitant to this day about it. So this is Brigham Young. And the second review / third said, you need this quote. If the Bible be translated incorrectly, and there is a scholar on the earth who professes to be a Christian, and he can translate it any better than King James's translators did it, he is under obligation to do so, or the curse is upon him. If I understood Greek and Hebrew, as some may profess to do, and I knew the Bible was not correctly translated, I should feel myself bound by the law of justice to the inhabitants of the earth to translate that which is incorrect, and give it just as it was spoken anciently. Is that proper? Yes, I would be under obligation. There's a reason I didn't put it in the first drafts. I started out with my students in mind. I did not start out to get rid of a prophetic curse. It's nice, that's a subsequent kind of benefit that you might have, but I didn't start with that purpose. And I think by putting it there, it functions as a justification in Mormon authoritative discourse. But more than anything are the thing that means so much to me. I received a letter just a couple days ago from a good friend who's using it in California. And he said, Tom, we're reading the Bible as a family for the first time in our lives. He said, it's so wonderful that their 5-year-old is able to participate and hear the story, and it's kind of elevated it to where they can read it. And maybe de-elevation is the wrong word. And he said, but I have a quibble. And so I was really happy. And he said, but we had to have now a family home evening lesson on circumcision. So there's a downside. I'm going to acknowledge that. He said, fortunately, we passed on the lesson on virginity. So yeah. So they must have been reading Luke 2 and Matthew 1 and getting those terms, and chose to tackle one and not the other. I hope if you felt anything tonight, if you've experienced anything in what I've said, it's that my heartfelt desire is to increase Bible literacy. I've worked a lot with Joseph Smith's sayings. I'm not an expert. I don't pretend to be. I doubt he could say a paragraph without a Bible allusion. Maybe that's a little strong, but probably not. The Bible was the way he defined his identity. He was always in conversation with the Bible. And I want that to return. I want us to be part of that. It's great to have kids that think in terms of the Book of Mormon. We've done well for President Benson, but let's bring it back. Let's make it something new. And I thank you so much for listening. I think we have a minute to take questions now, Kurt.
More than a minute.
Okay, more than a minute.
Several minutes.
Okay, we have several minutes, and you probably have to speak loudly for me to hear. Way in the back there.
And will you repeat it?
Two thoughts. One is, I wonder if somebody said along the way, maybe it was J. Reuben Clark when he published Why the King James Version, somebody said that one of the reasons we would stick with the King James was because the Book of Mormon was written in King James English. That's one thought. And the other one is, I'm curious about the timing. We went to the New Testament Symposium at BYU on Saturday.
Yes.
Where, by the way, your project was praised to the hilt by Eric Husband.
Oh, thanks.
And he told us all to read it. But the timing is curious because all of your fellow BYU professors are working on the BYU New Testament commentary. And right now, as we're doing the New Testament Sunday School, I'm trying to do both. I'm using yours and I'm using that, and it's like, gee, I'm looking at this new rendition, and then I'm looking at Tom Wayment's, new translation from the Greek, and the timing is just kind of weird. So
Yeah. So just to repeat for the camera and anybody that might not be able to hear that. First of all, the first question was, what do we do, or how do we engage J. Reuben Clark's Why the King James, and the kind of imprimatur that the King James receives in the 1968 Aspen Grove Discourse? And that's a great question. I would say that I was strongly encouraged to not see that as the problem that it is perceived to be, because the church has moved well beyond that in all of its other foreign languages. So that the Book of Mormon and the Bible in Spanish, for example, where I've done the most work on other translations, they don't have that kind of congruity, and it's functioning well. So I think that while that was true, I think we have to remember that Clark was responding primarily to the publication of the RSV. He viewed it as outlandish. He called it, quote, humanist, which is apparently a really bad word in the 1960s, and he assumes a number of things today which aren't accurate historically. So yes, I was encouraged that the time is right to be both respectful for what he did and see that we are people living 50, 60 years beyond that. The next question was the incongruity of having other work done, the new rendition done by the New Testament commentary series, and to do it, to have my work kind of almost collide with that. I think that was kind of the spirit of what was asked. I'm very good friends with all of the folks working. Well, I count them as friends. Whether they count me as friends, I can't say for sure. But I am very good friends with all of the people working on the commentary series. And I debated long and hard when I did my translation whether I should do a committee project like they are doing. And I got very nervous about 6 years ago and decided maybe a committee was the best thing to do, because if I go the route of a committee, this will never see the light of day. And there was safety in not seeing the light of day. I do really mean that. I thought once we have it in a committee, once there's someone appointed above it, this will be DOA. And there was part of me that thought, okay, I tried, I fought the fight, I wasn't dying in that ditch. And the other thing I'm really passionate about, I think Tyndale did something. I think Wycliffe did something. And I think there's some value in the same person bringing their skill set to the Bible. And so while I admire the New Testament commentary series and the work they're doing, I think the work they're doing should prioritize the text work they're doing and not the translation. The translations are done in a I want to do a positive version of the word haphazard. I'm not trying to criticize it, but it's a bit random, and some of them are stronger than others, and I wanted to bring power to that voice consistently. So yeah, that's a really great question.
Do you have an opinion about the publication, the Bible in 26 translations?
So the question is, do I have an opinion about the publication, the Bible in 26 translations, which I assume is a product that has all of these side by side?
Yes.
Oh, no, I don't, but I do use one every day called BibleGateway.com. I use Blue Letter Bible and Olive Leaf, which are effectively 200 plus that you can toggle side by side. So I really encourage comparative Bible study. That's very valuable. Anyone looking for good comparison Bibles, there's a ton of safety in RSV and NIV, although Romans stinks in NIV. You see, I have some problems with Romans, but NIV and the CEV is really good if you want a very modern feel. Sometimes it gets a little bit almost too modern, but it is, your kids would love it, for example. Jesus hasn't evolved all the way to calling the 12 disciples the dudes, and they don't call him the man, but it's getting down there. So, but it is pretty accurate. Yeah. Yes.
In the New Testament and the Old Testament, women, it seems to be, are either left out, maybe, or are not as important.
Yes.
Or are considered, for example, Mary Magdalene a prostitute. Did you find changes?
Yes, so the question for everybody that can't hear is that the New Testament, but particularly the Bible, tends to suppress the story of women. And I set out from day one to make this gender inclusive. Greek, anthropos and andros are not exclusive of women. The King James translators always translate that as men. And so Jesus, whenever he speaks to with the Greek terms that mean man and woman, I put them both there. And that caused a little bit of friction at times when we have a subsequent singular pronoun, whether to use he and she, or a lot of translations then shift that to they. So I've tried to be clear in the notes when I've had to change a pronoun to reflect gender inclusive language. But absolutely, I'm so glad you asked, because that was so important to me. Women have so few religious identity figures and people of faith, and to have Jesus speaking now directly to our female saints is wonderful. But a lot of translations have done that way prior to me.
And I know the Catholic Church back in the Middle Ages, when they translated it, I cannot remember which saint.
Probably Jerome is who you're thinking.
Jerome. It seemed like they put it in terms of their doctrine. And that included also suppressing women. So did you find that women were different and not considered prostitutes or lower than men?
Yeah, so the larger question is what kind of big picture things could we say about the role and kind of performance of women? I don't love the word role, but the way women perform faith, live lives of faith. So you're going to see a lot of emphasis in the notes, especially in the Pauline churches, to recover things like the role of Phoebe, who is kind of effectively the leader of the church in her home, how that works in a stratigraphy. So I'm trying to be honest with saying we have a situation where women own the home, they manage the home, and the church meets in their home, and so they oversee a lot of these things. And I've tried where in every case where there's a woman's story to recover that. But this other subtle question, Mary Magdalene the prostitute, that's a very late misunderstanding reading of John. I forgot the chapter, but it's about 8 and then Luke 8:2. So that's what I think it is. But yeah, so they disavowed that in 1970 something. They said no more of that. Catholic Church.
Okay.
Catholic Church openly disavowed that connection. So I think there was a hand somewhere midstream here and then here. Yes, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wondered if it would be published in a larger print edition and maybe also audio book.
I don't know those answers. I was told by the publisher that a hardback version is in the works, and Kurt seemed to know more about the date of it than I do. In March. I'm out of the stream, if you will, so I don't know that, but I'm unaware of that.
Just got a question about what you anticipate. You mentioned this is not authorized, or it's not, and said this is the way that we're going to, as a church, adopt it, but yet we can't deny the fact that your book is selling out everywhere. And so will it be maybe incumbent upon the brethren who speak and make such a fetish out of using certain words to make a point in their sermons which don't come across as correctly in the Greek translation? Will they be forced to maybe change that a little bit? I noticed Elder Holland gave a talk on the parable of the laborer, and I thought he used the Living Scripture translation of that. And a couple other general authorities have in their footnotes, have used a different version.
Yeah.
Do we see more of that coming?
So for everybody there in the back, the question is it incumbent upon the church to adopt more modern language translations? I'm going to totally dodge that question. And just the words "the church should never issue from my mouth." So
Culture, with the culture of the church.
So I'm not going to dodge the kind of essence of the question, which is, what are we seeing in the church that would indicate an awareness of a larger Bible culture? And so we do know that Elder Uchtdorf is consistently quoting from a modern translation of the Bible, and those are included in the published ensign. So if you watch carefully, he is he's using a modern language translation, very, very good one, and the notes will give you the acronym for it. Elder Holland and President Nelson have both used modern translation of the Bible. The next thing I'm about to say, I want to be extremely careful with. You hear some of the brethren use very clear Greek statements. They're translating Greek. We just heard President Nelson do it. I believe it was in April. And they do reach out to people for help. I think there's a growing community identity rather than a growing hostility towards this. And I don't want to give anybody imprimatur or not, but they know what they're doing, and I'm happy to say that. I hope that helps, and I hope it grows. I hope more people use it. That would be my dream. There, on the standing there.
Do you know of any of your colleagues who are doing the same kind of thing for the Hebrew Old Testament? And second, or should we just adopt Robert Alter's translation?
Alter's wonderful. So anybody that couldn't hear the question, is there a similar effort underfoot for the Old Testament? And should we, if not, should we adopt Robert Alter's? Isn't it it's 800 pages, I believe.
3 volumes.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. Alter is amazing, and a lot of depth. And a very decidedly Jewish translation, and that was an intentional component of Alter's work. Is there another effort underfoot? Give me 10 years.
Only 10?
I'm partway done. So,
Oh, you're partway done.
so yeah, I'm gonna get there, and
So
yeah.
you're studying Hebrew.
I have that. So I'm doing simultaneous Hebrew and Septuagint. So I have Masoretic on one and Greek on the other, and I'm putting all of the Greek differences to the Masoretic text in the notes, which I believe is a new thing to have that. So there are tons of things. So yeah, give me a decade, and I won't die for this one, and we'll see where we end up, and hopefully Kurt will have me back. Yeah.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
What are you doing in terms of publication on JST?
Oh, thank you. So what am I doing in terms of JST? This is a really big conversation that I hope can make a meaningful response to. In my other life, I do a lot of textual work on the Joseph Smith translation, and discovered in 2013 that Joseph Smith used a commentary, a popular commentary on the Bible, and to create the JST. And that article will be published, I hear now, in fall of this year or just January of next, theoretically. It's been in publication process for 5 years. But
Where?
University of Utah Press.
Oh, okay.
So it was rejected at Oxford. It's not a big deal, but the editor sent it to Oxford. Oxford didn't want it. It wasn't particularly my chapter, but a bunch of other concerns. So that should be out. So why I say all that? I had to, when I created the notes for this, I had to factor out all of the places that Adam Clark has influenced the JST, believing that that is pure commentary. The other factor that's a major issue that's really hard to get this word out, about 70% of the JST simply goes away in a modern translation. A lot of the JST is to modernize and make it readable, and so that just literally goes away because you're catching the same things he's doing in a modern translation. And that effectively leaves the larger, longer revelatory insertions, and they're in the notes. And they're in KJV language. I debated sorely. You'll think I'm a terrible heathen for saying this, but I really wanted to translate the JST into modern English. I wanted to do that so badly. I knew I would die for that, so I did not do that. But you do have KJV in the notes where, and it's not out of disrespect, it's so that you understand what the difference is in mine versus his. And that's all I was trying to do, but I decided not to do that. Yeah.
You mentioned that there's text that in the NA28 that's not that's not in the NA28 that is in our King James version.
Yes.
Where does that come from?
So
is there a Greek source for that?
So the bigger question for anybody that couldn't hear that, so why is it that the King James Version has text that now is viewed as no longer being original or written by the original authors? The King James Bible was created on a manuscript basis of 9 manuscripts that were in or around within 100 miles of Rotterdam. And he was able to go out to various locales, gather these 9 manuscripts. The most important of them is a Bezai derivative. That might not mean anything to some of you, but Bezai is Codex D, an important 5th century text. That's the best he had. And the rest were pretty poor. And so he's translating what I would call Byzantine and then medieval manuscripts. But what's happened since he worked on it is that we have discovered papyri that predate that by 400 years. We have papyri now from roughly 125 going forward. And as we assemble this mass of text, we have now 5,300 of them that are known and identified, we've started to get a much fuller picture of what the Bible is. So it's not a hostility ever to the KJV. It was just he did something groundbreaking. He said, for the very first time, I'm going to gather as many as I can. He compiled them and said, I'm going to create a translation of the compilation. Prior to that, people said, well, in my church, I have this manuscript, I'll translate it, and then somebody else would do it here and it'd be different. And he created the art of text criticism. I'm a beneficiary of that process. He brought 9, I brought 5,300, and that's the difference. And one other major difference for anybody interested, it's estimated that there are 500,000 variants between all the manuscripts, if we kind of listed them. In the Hebrew Bible, there's probably a third of that total. So even though the Hebrew Bible is 3 times as long, there's probably 1/3 to 1/5 of the variants. Hebrew Bible is much more static. There's not a lot of variants, text missing, and things that way. Yeah, we miss a psalm and a few minor things in the Hebrew Bible. Question here, and then in the back there.
What have you learned about the Book of Mormon from the intertextuality with the New Testament?
So, what have I learned about the Book of Mormon from the intertextuality with the New Testament? I'm a modernist, and so I want to shelf right now historicity, so that what I say, I don't mean to contradict that. I am fascinated by the depth of engagement it's asking about things like the Pauline body. It quotes 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 51 3 times, and each time it's subtly nuancing it, trying to understand it, engage it. And those are in the mouths of prophets. So the Book of Mormon is not copying, but you have the words of the New Testament in their mouths, and they're adding things to it. And so to me, it's wonderfully rich. But I hear the other thing that I'm saying, and some people are hurt by this, that you're saying that the Book of Mormon's a 19th century text. I don't want to say that. I don't know how to handle that personally, but I do know that if we can overlook that for a moment, you'll find the Book of Mormon engaging things powerfully. And I read the Book of Mormon in the process because I didn't trust the computer comparison, and I sat down and read the whole thing with the eyes of where is it engaging the New Testament, and it's not continuous. It never engages like Matthew 13, 14, and 15. It engages a verse here, and a verse here, and a verse here, and it puts them together in new combinations that you would never see. So I think it's a really powerful voice to that, and different than I had expected. So thank you. In the very back, you have a hat on.
Yeah. So I have 2 questions. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can, I think.
My first question is, can you give any examples, if possible, of how Adam Clarke's commentary directly influenced the Joseph Smith translation? And then my second question is, in doing your research, did you come across things written deliberately by, or in connection with Joseph Smith by maybe like a scribe or himself, where they inserted notes on a manuscript that shows that they were using that commentary?
Oh, sure. So this goes back to the larger question of how and when and in what way can we determine Adam Clarke influence in Joseph Smith's Bible project. It became apparent to me, it might seem a really mundane thing, but he reorganizes 2 verses in Colossians 1, I believe it's 20 and 21, and he flips them, and that's just odd. And I'd always, up until about 5 years ago, thought that was an error. Adam Clarke says he has a note. These verses need to be reversed their order. And I thought, these are literally on the planet that I knew of, and I started searching like mad. These are the only 2 Bibles anywhere that switch those 2 verses in order. And I set up a series of about 18 test passages, and about a third of them hit that had exact statements by Clarke in there. Another one was really kind of conclusive. The KJV in Isaiah, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the chapter, says the words unicorns, and Adam Clarke says, those are not unicorns, they're probably rhinoceroses, plural, whatever, rhinoceroi, and the rhinoceroses are really Hebrew re'im, and he uses a really peculiar transliteration system of that word, and that's the exact word Joseph puts in the JST. He gets rid of unicorns, and he writes Adam Clark's Re'im. And it's a smoking gun for a text critic because only Adam Clark was using that type of transliteration of Hebrew. So it actually should be Ra'im, and so he even does it a little peculiar. So it's pretty clear. I will say this in a general picture on Adam Clark. He uses Adam Clark for word study. He uses Adam Clark for textual things. He like for example, there's an ambiguity as a result of an italics, and he'll go to Adam Clark and look at that, try to clarify the italics. There, to my knowledge, are no long insertions associated with Adam Clark, none of the kind of big additions. They almost always are 1 to 3 words, and in a kind of area that you don't see in your footnotes, because the 79 committee didn't typically even put those in. So, and they are exclusively from Matthew through Revelation, and then they appear a couple in Genesis 25, and then they go all the way through Malachi. Probably true that the Song of Solomon declaration that this is not inspired is Adam Clark. He uses almost the same language, so it probably follows that. Adam Clark, by the way, thought it was a sex poem, so he said this is not inspired. Joseph left out the sex poem part, just said this is not inspired. So that kind of thing. So, question there in the back, the very back.
In your interview with Charles Gibbons, you mentioned that you do believe that some of the letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul are not by Paul. So do you go along with there's only 7 definite letters from Paul?
Oh, so for anybody that couldn't hear the question, I have a statement in another interview where I said something along the lines that I have questions about Pauline authorship. And there's really, the current thinking is that there's 7 letters that are absolutely Pauline, and then we have a secondary group called the Deutero-Paulines, and then we have a third group that are called the Pauline School today. So that's the kind of scholarly view. When I started translating, I had almost no opinion on this topic. So I just didn't think it mattered. I'd heard it in graduate school. I had never felt it was a kind of meaningful thing I should discuss. However, having translated it, I want to slightly alter your question and the way you've thought about it. I don't want to make a declaration whether Paul did or did not write it. I want to say linguistically that the 7 letters typically attributed to Paul are by the same person as a translator. The letters Colossians and Ephesians are written by the same person, but not the author of the other 7. The Greek is just so different. In my opinion, the author of Ephesians and Colossians have to be the same person. The person who wrote the pastoral epistles is also the same person, but not the one who wrote the 7 and not who wrote Ephesians and Colossians. As a translator, I would stick to that. Now, does that mean Paul couldn't have been involved? That's a larger historical question I didn't try to answer, and I'd like to try to avoid even, just for the fact I don't want people to get caught up on that. But as a translator, they're not the same. They're very different style. In fact, the worst sentence I think in the entire New Testament is 1 John 1, 1 through 3. That's the most corrupt. The longest and worst grammar sentence is Ephesians 1, 1 through 10, a single sentence. With 3, I believe, finite verbs. Just terrible Greek, but somebody launched it. So kind of a dodge, but hopefully I helped a little bit. Here, I think you're right here in a purple shirt, maybe?
Yeah.
And Kurt's coming to tell us to stop. Oh, okay.
So you mentioned that there's a scripture in the Book of Mormon that is about the same quote as from the Bible, and yet the scripture in the Bible is disputed as being in the original text.
Yes.
Is it possible that we just haven't found the right ancient writing that might have that in it?
It's possible, and that's a kind of approach that's been taken very common, and I'm not pushing back against that. I do believe personally, just a belief, not an academic position for me, that Joseph's own tongue is so embedded in the language of the King James Bible that his expression unknowingly comes from that. And I think it's part of who he is. I think if I had said to Joseph, hey, you quoted 1 John 5:7 in Alma, he would not know what I was talking about. But if he used the word Father, Son, Holy Ghost, he defaulted to 1 John 5:7's formulation. So I think it's part of him rather than an intentionality.
Okay, I think we're done.